You ever hear something so cruel, so cold, that it just sticks in your chest like a shard of glass? Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me the day my own son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mom, let's be honest. You're nothing without us." And the worst part? He said it like it was a fact, like he was doing me a favor by telling the truth. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 67 years old, and apparently, according to my son, I'm nothing. But here's the funny thing about people who underestimate you. They forget something important. Old people? We've lived long enough to know exactly where the skeletons are buried. And sometimes, we're the ones who buried them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my son, Daniel, showed up at my house, unannounced, which already felt strange. Daniel doesn't just drop by, not unless he needs something. Behind him stood his wife, Caroline, holding her designer purse like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. And trailing behind them was my grandson, Tyler, glued to his phone like the world would end if he looked up for 2 seconds. I opened the door and smiled. "Daniel, what a surprise!" He gave me that quick half hug people give when they're trying to look affectionate but really aren't feeling it. "You got a minute, Mom?" Something about the tone made my stomach twist, but I stepped aside anyway. "Of course, come in." They walked into my living room like real estate agents inspecting a property. Caroline's eyes moved around the room slowly, judging. Always judging. She brushed invisible dust off the couch before sitting down. I pretended not to notice. "Coffee?" I asked. "No time," Daniel said. That's when I knew something was wrong, because Daniel never says no to coffee. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, serious face. The same face he used when he was 12 and about to confess he'd broken a neighbor's baseball with a baseball. "Mom, we need to talk about the house." My house? The one I've lived in for 42 years? The one my husband built with his own hands before he passed away? I folded my hands in my lap. "What about it?" Daniel sighed, like I was already being difficult. "Well, we've been thinking, Caroline and I." Caroline nodded slightly. "It doesn't make sense for you to stay here alone anymore." There it was, the sentence older parents everywhere eventually hear, the polite version of "you're inconvenient now." I smiled carefully. I like living here. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, come on, the place is huge. You're just one person." Caroline leaned forward. "And the market is amazing right now." "Of course, the market. Always the market." Daniel continued. "If we sell the house, you could move somewhere smaller, maybe a retirement community." Retirement community. I looked around my living room. Photos on the walls. Daniel as a kid. His graduation. My husband holding baby Tyler. 42 years of life. And they were talking about it like it was a used car. "Why the sudden interest?" I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. Caroline didn't. "Well," she said, "Tyler's starting college next year, and tuition isn't cheap." Ah, now the truth arrives. "So you want to sell my house to pay for Tyler's college?" Daniel raised his hands defensively. "It wouldn't just help Tyler, it would help everyone." I nodded slowly. "And where exactly would I go?" Caroline smiled, not kindly. "We found a very nice senior apartment complex." She pulled out a brochure, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Daniel slid it across the table. I didn't touch it. "Mom," Daniel said softly, "this is the smart move." I looked him straight in the eyes. "I'm not selling the house." Silence. Heavy silence. Caroline's smile vanished instantly. Daniel leaned back in the chair. "Mom, don't make this difficult." I almost laughed. "I'm not the one making it difficult." Caroline scoffed. "Oh, please." Daniel shot her a warning look, but she was already standing up. "You know what? Let's just say it. Here we go." She crossed her arms. "This house is the only thing you have, Margaret." Daniel whispered, "Caroline." But she kept going. "You live off Daniel's help, you don't work, and you sit in a house that could actually help this family." Then Daniel said the sentence, the one that changed everything. He stood up slowly, looked me right in the eyes, and said, "Mom, you're nothing without us." The room went completely silent. Even Tyler looked up from his phone. For a second, just 1 second, I felt something inside my chest crack. But then something else happened. A memory surfaced. A memory Daniel clearly forgot. I stood up slowly, smiled. Not angry, not sad, just calm. "You're right, Daniel." That seemed to surprise him. Caroline blinked. "What?" I grabbed my purse from the chair. "Well, you said I'm nothing without you." Daniel frowned. "Yeah?" I walked toward the door. "Well," I said, grabbing my tees, "I guess we'll find out in the next 24 hours. Caroline laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, please, what are you going to do?" I opened the door, turned around one last time, and said the words that would change their lives forever. "Something you're really not going to like." Then I stepped outside and made a phone call I hadn't made in 15 years. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sounded older, but I recognized it instantly. "Hi, Richard," I said calmly. "This is Margaret Collins." A pause. Then a surprised laugh. "Well, I'll be damned, Margaret." I smiled slightly. "Richard, remember that favor you owe me?" Another pause. Then he said something that made me realize this was about to get interesting. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I've been waiting 20 years for you to ask. And within the next 24 hours, my son was going to learn something he should have remembered. His mother was never nothing." The night my son called me nothing, I slept better than I had in years. Funny, right? You'd think something like that would break a mother, but the truth is, when someone finally shows you who they really are, it can be incredibly freeing. At 6 a.m. sharp, I was already dressed. Black slacks, cream blouse, the pearl necklace my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror. Not bad for 67. "All right, Margaret," I whispered. "Let's remind them who you are." Then I grabbed my purse and headed out. By 7:30 a.m., I was sitting in a sleek glass office building downtown, a building my son had probably driven past 100 times without ever knowing the truth about it. The receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" I returned the smile. "Oh, honey," I said gently, "I don't need one." Before she could respond, the elevator doors opened, and out walked a tall man in a charcoal suit, silver hair, sharp eyes, authority in every step. The moment he saw me, he froze. Then he burst out laughing. "Margaret Collins!" The entire lobby turned to look. The man walked straight over and pulled me into a hug. "Richard Hayes! Still alive and still running the city, I see?" He grinned. "Barely, but you disappeared." Richard Hayes, CEO of Hayes & Carter Holdings, a billion-dollar investment firm and one of the most powerful men in the state. But 20 years ago, he was just a desperate young businessman with a company on the edge of collapse, and I was the woman who saved him. We walked into his office overlooking the skyline. Richard poured 2 coffees. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what brings you out of retirement?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "My son." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" I chuckled softly. "He told me I'm nothing without him." Richard blinked once. Then he started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, a full belly laugh. Oh my God, does he actually believe that? Apparently. Then his face turned serious. "So, what do you need?" I leaned forward. "I want to make a purchase." Richard's expression sharpened instantly. What kind of purchase? I slid a folder across his desk. He opened it, and then he whistled. Well, damn. Inside the folder was the company profile of Daniel Collins Construction, my son's company. Richard looked up slowly. You want to buy your son's business? Not exactly, I smiled. I want to own it. He leaned back in his chair again. Margaret, your son owns 60% of this company. Not anymore. Richard flipped another page in the folder, and that's when his eyebrows shot up. Oh, this is interesting. Because Daniel had made one very big mistake. To expand his company last year, he'd taken on investors, a lot of them. And investors, they can sell. Richard looked carefully at me. How many shares do you want? All of them. His grin slowly returned. You're serious? Completely. Richard tapped the folder thoughtfully. You realize what this means, right? I nodded. Daniel will wake up tomorrow working for his mother. We both smiled. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel was having breakfast with Caroline and complaining about me. She's being stubborn, he said, scrolling through his phone. Caroline rolled her eyes. Old people get emotional about houses. She'll come around. Caroline sipped her coffee. She better. That house is worth almost $900,000. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down casually, then frowned. Another notification popped up, then another. 3 emails, all from investors. Subject line, urgent share transfer notice. Daniel frowned deeper. That's weird. He opened the first email. His face slowly drained of color. Caroline noticed immediately. What? Daniel whispered. That can't be right. Daniel, what is it? He looked up at her, completely pale. Someone just bought all the investors' shares in my company. Caroline blinked. What? Daniel swallowed. That means whoever did this now owns, he checked the numbers again, 51% of the company. Caroline's eyes widened. Who would do that? Daniel refreshed his email, and then a 4th message arrived from the law firm handling the transfer. He opened it, read one line, and felt his stomach drop to the floor because the email said, Congratulations, the majority shareholder meeting will be held tomorrow morning. Attendance required. Caroline leaned closer. Who bought the shares? Daniel stared at the sender's name, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know. But across town, sitting in Richard's office, I watched him sign the final document. He slid it across the table to me. Margaret Collins, he said with a grin. Congratulations. I picked up the pen, signed my name slowly, and officially became the majority owner of my son's company. Richard leaned back in amazement. You really are something else. I stood up. Well, Richard, I said, closing the folder, my son thinks I'm nothing. Richard laughed again. Not for long. I checked the time. 8:48 a.m. 24 hours wasn't even half over yet, and tomorrow morning Daniel was going to walk into a boardroom expecting to meet with his investors. Instead, he was going to find me sitting at the head of the table, and the look on his face, oh, I couldn't wait to see it. The next morning, Daniel Collins woke up feeling sick. Not physically, the kind of sick that sits in your gut when something isn't right. He barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept seeing that email. Majority shareholder transfer. Someone now owned more of his company than he did, and he had no idea who it was. Caroline was pacing around the kitchen while he drank his coffee. This is ridiculous, she said. How does someone just buy half a company overnight? Daniel rubbed his temples. They didn't buy half. Caroline stopped. What do you mean? They bought 51%. Her eyes widened. So whoever this person is, they're the boss now. Daniel didn't answer, because the truth felt like a punch to the chest. By 9:15 a.m., Daniel walked into the glass office building that housed his company, the same company he started 12 years ago, the same company he believed he controlled. Employees nodded politely as he walked past. "Morning, Mr. Collins." "Good morning." But Daniel barely heard them. His mind was racing. Who could it be? A competitor? An investment group? A corporate shark trying to swallow his business whole? Caroline followed closely behind him in her heels. "Well," she muttered, "whoever it is better know what they're doing." Daniel stepped into the elevator. The ride to the 12th floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, something immediately felt strange. Several unfamiliar people were standing near the conference room. Lawyers, at least 3 of them. Daniel frowned. "What's going on?" One of the assistants spoke carefully. "The majority shareholder meeting is about to begin, sir." Daniel nodded stiffly. "Right." He walked toward the conference room doors. Caroline whispered beside him, "Just stay confident. You built this company." He nodded, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. Inside the conference room, everyone was already seated. Investors, lawyers, board members, and one empty chair at the head of the table. Daniel frowned again. Who's sitting there? A lawyer adjusted his glasses. The majority shareholder. Daniel scoffed slightly. "Well, they're late." The lawyer checked his watch. "No," he said calmly, "they're right on time." And then the door behind Daniel opened. Slowly, every head in the room turned. Daniel turned too, and froze. Because walking into the room, wearing black slacks, a cream blouse, and her pearl necklace, was Margaret Collins, his mother. For a full 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Caroline blinked. "Margaret?" Daniel laughed nervously. "Mom? What are you doing here?" I walked calmly toward the table, every step echoing in the silent room. "Oh," I said lightly, "I have a meeting." Daniel frowned. "With who?" I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one reserved for the majority shareholder. Then I sat down, crossed my hands neatly, and smiled. "With you." The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline's mouth actually fell open. Daniel stared at me like he'd just seen a ghost. "What?" He looked at the lawyers, then back at me. "What kind of joke is this?" One of the lawyers slid a document across the table. "Mr. Collins," he said calmly, "this is the official transfer agreement." Daniel grabbed the papers. His eyes scanned the page rapidly. Then slower, then again, because right there, in bold letters, was my name. Margaret Collins, majority shareholder, 51% ownership. Daniel whispered, "No." Caroline leaned over his shoulder. Her face turned pale instantly. This isn't real." I tilted my head slightly. "Oh, honey," I said sweetly, "it's very real." Daniel slammed the papers down. "How?" His voice echoed through the room. "You don't even work." I smiled. "You're right." Daniel ran his hair through his hair. This has to be some mistake." One of the investors spoke calmly. "It's not. Mrs. Collins purchased all available investor shares yesterday morning." Daniel slowly turned back to me, his face full of disbelief. "You bought my company?" I corrected him gently. "No." I leaned forward slightly. "I bought control of it." Caroline shook her head. "This is insane." Daniel pointed at me. "You can't run this business." The room went silent again. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Daniel," I said softly, "you still think you know everything about me." He stared at me. "What does that mean?" I looked around the table, at the lawyers, at the investors, then back at my son, and smiled. "You remember how you told me yesterday?" I paused. "That I'm nothing without you?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes." I leaned back in the chair. Funny thing about that, the entire room felt tense, like the air itself was waiting. Then I said the sentence that made several investors smile. "Before you started this company," I announced proudly, "I spent 30 years building 3 of them." Daniel blinked. "What?" Caroline whispered under her breath. "That's impossible." But one of the older investors chuckled quietly. "Actually, it's not." Daniel looked at him in confusion. The investor leaned forward.
Your mother helped build Hayes and Carter Holdings from the ground up. Daniel's face went blank, because Hayes and Carter was worth billions. Daniel slowly looked back at me. You never told me that? I smiled calmly. You never asked. Caroline whispered under her breath. Oh my God. Daniel sat down slowly, like his legs had stopped working. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then I folded my hands and said calmly, now that introductions are out of the way, I glanced around the table, let's talk about the future of this company. Daniel's voice was barely steady. You're not serious. Oh, I'm very serious. He shook his head. You wouldn't do this to me. I looked him straight in the eyes. Wouldn't I? The room held its breath. Then I slid another document across the table. Before we continue, I said calmly, there's one more thing you should know. Daniel looked down at the paper. His eyes widened slowly. Wait, Caroline leaned closer. What is it? Daniel's voice came out barely above a whisper. This says, he looked back at me, completely stunned. You can fire the CEO? I smiled. Correct. Caroline's face turned ghost white. Daniel stared at me. Mom? The words sounded different now, not confident, not arrogant, just scared. And that's when I said the sentence that changed the entire room. Daniel, I paused, then smiled softly, you're not the boss here anymore.
For the first time in his life, Daniel Collins looked small. Not physically, but the kind of small a man becomes when the ground under his feet suddenly disappears. He sat there in the boardroom chair, staring at the document in front of him like it might change if he blinked hard enough. But it didn't. Right there in black and white were the words that changed everything. Majority shareholder, Margaret Collins. Across the table, I watched him quietly. Not angry, not smug, just patient. Because patience is something you learn when you've lived long enough. Caroline was the first one to break the silence. This is ridiculous! Her voice shook slightly. You can't just walk in here and take someone's company. One of the lawyers calmly cleared his throat. Actually, she can. Caroline turned toward him sharply. What? He adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Collins legally purchased the majority shares yesterday. That gives her controlling authority. Caroline looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Daniel finally looked up at me. Mom, the confidence he usually carried was gone now. You don't understand what you're doing. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? This company is complicated, he said quickly. There are contracts, projects, payroll. And you think I don't understand business? I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the room exactly what he'd been thinking his entire life, that his mother was just old, harmless, irrelevant. I leaned forward slightly. Daniel, I signed my first business contract before you finished high school. A few investors nodded knowingly. Caroline scoffed. Well, if you're such a business genius, she snapped, why have you been living in that old house for 40 years? Ah, there it was, the insult. I smiled gently. Because I liked it. Caroline rolled her eyes dramatically. Please. Daniel rubbed his face. Mom, what do you actually want? Finally, the real question. I folded my hands neatly on the table. What I want is respect. Daniel frowned. You have respect. I tilted my head slightly. Do I? His silence answered that question. The room felt heavier now, more serious. Then Daniel leaned forward. Look, if this is about yesterday, Caroline snapped. She's being dramatic. Daniel ignored her. Mom, I'm sorry if what I said hurt you. I watched him carefully. He was apologizing, but not because he felt bad, because he was scared. Big difference. I nodded slowly. You said I'm nothing without you. Daniel looked down. I didn't mean it like that.
Caroline muttered under her breath, "He kind of did." Daniel shot her a look, but the damage was already done. I leaned back in my chair. "Here's the funny thing, Daniel." The room went quiet again. "For years, I watched you build this company." He nodded slowly. "You did. And for years," I continued, "I stayed quiet." Caroline crossed her arms. "Why?" I looked straight at her. "Because I wanted to see the kind of man my son would become." Daniel swallowed. "And?" I paused, just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. "That jury's still out." One of the investors chuckled quietly. Daniel didn't. He looked exhausted now. "Mom, please." There it was. The word please. Something Daniel almost never said. "What do you want me to do?" I slid another document across the table. "This is the new company structure." He opened it slowly. As he read, his eyes widened again. "What the hell is this?" Caroline leaned over his shoulder. Then she gasped. "You're demoting him?" Daniel looked up at me in disbelief. "You're making me vice president?" I nodded calmly. "That's correct." "But I built this company." "And you'll continue working here," I said gently. Caroline slammed her hand on the table. "This is insane." One of the lawyers spoke firmly. "Mrs. Collins has full authority to restructure leadership." Caroline looked ready to explode. Daniel stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. "You'd humiliate me like this?" I met his eyes. "You humiliated me first." The room fell silent again. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair, angry now. "You know what?" he said bitterly. "Fine." He tossed the document on the table. "If you think you can run this company better than me, go ahead." Caroline nodded aggressively. "Yeah, let's see how long that lasts." Daniel crossed his arms. "You'll come crawling back in a month." I smiled slowly. "Oh, Daniel." He frowned. "What?" I looked around the table, then back at him. "You still think this is about revenge?" He blinked. "Isn't it?" I shook my head. "No." Then I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. I slid it across the table. "This is about survival." Daniel frowned as he picked it up. His eyes moved across the page. Then suddenly all the color drained from his face. Caroline whispered, "What is it?" Daniel's voice barely worked. "This says," he looked back at me, terrified now, "the company is about to go bankrupt?" The entire room went silent. Caroline grabbed the paper. "What?" One of the investors leaned forward. Daniel looked at me slowly. "You knew about this?" I nodded calmly. "For months." His voice cracked. "And you didn't tell me?" I folded my hands. "You never asked." Daniel stared at the financial report again. Numbers, debt, loans, interest, millions of dollars. His hands started shaking. "This can't be right." I sighed softly. "Oh, Daniel." Then I said the sentence that made his world collapse. "You didn't build a company." I paused. "You built a time bomb." For the first time in his life, Daniel Collins looked small. Not physically, but the kind of small a man becomes when the ground under his feet suddenly disappears. He sat there in the boardroom chair, staring at the document in front of him like it might change if he blinked hard enough. But it didn't. Right there in black and white were the words that changed everything. Majority shareholder, Margaret Collins. Across the table, I watched him quietly. Not angry, not smug, just patient. Because patience is something you learn when you've lived long enough. Caroline was the first one to break the silence. "This is ridiculous!" Her voice shook slightly. "You can't just walk in here and take someone's company." One of the lawyers calmly cleared his throat. "Actually, she can." Caroline turned toward him sharply. "What?" He adjusted his glasses.
Mrs. Collins legally purchased the majority shares yesterday. That gives her controlling authority. Caroline looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Daniel finally looked up at me. Mom, the confidence he usually carried was gone now. You don't understand what you're doing. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? This company is complicated, he said quickly. There are contracts, projects, payroll. And you think I don't understand business? I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the room exactly what he'd been thinking his entire life, that his mother was just old, harmless, irrelevant. I leaned forward slightly. Daniel, I signed my first business contract before you finished high school. A few investors nodded knowingly. Caroline scoffed. Well, if you're such a business genius, she snapped, why have you been living in that old house for 40 years? Ah, there it was, the insult. I smiled gently. Because I liked it. Caroline rolled her eyes dramatically. Please. Daniel rubbed his face. Mom, what do you actually want? Finally, the real question. I folded my hands neatly on the table. What I want is respect. Daniel frowned. You have respect. I tilted my head slightly. Do I? His silence answered that question. The room felt heavier now, more serious. Then Daniel leaned forward. Look, if this is about yesterday, Caroline snapped. She's being dramatic. Daniel ignored her. Mom, I'm sorry if what I said hurt you. I watched him carefully. He was apologizing, but not because he felt bad, because he was scared. Big difference. I nodded slowly. You said I'm nothing without you. Daniel looked down. I didn't mean it like that. Caroline muttered under her breath. He kind of did. Daniel shot her a look, but the damage was already done. I leaned back in my chair. Here's the funny thing, Daniel. The room went quiet again. For years, I watched you build this company. He nodded slowly. You did. And for years, I continued, I stayed quiet. Caroline crossed her arms. Why? I looked straight at her. Because I wanted to see the kind of man my son would become. Daniel swallowed. And I paused, just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. That jury's still out. One of the investors chuckled quietly. Daniel didn't. He looked exhausted now. Mom, please. There it was. The word please. Something Daniel almost never said. What do you want me to do? I slid another document across the table. This is the new company structure. He opened it slowly. As he read, his eyes widened again. What the hell is this? Caroline leaned over his shoulder. Then she gasped. You're demoting him? Daniel looked up at me in disbelief. You're making me vice president? I nodded calmly. That's correct. But I built this company. And you'll continue working here, I said gently. Caroline slammed her hand on the table. This is insane. One of the lawyers spoke firmly. Mrs. Collins has full authority to restructure leadership. Caroline looked ready to explode. Daniel stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. You'd humiliate me like this? I met his eyes. You humiliated me first. The room fell silent again. Then Daniel leaned back in his chair, angry now. You know what? He said bitterly. Fine. He tossed the document on the table. If you think you can run this company better than me, go ahead. Caroline nodded aggressively. Yeah, let's see how long that lasts. Daniel crossed his arms. You'll come crawling back in a month. I smiled slowly. Oh, Daniel. He frowned. What? I looked around the table, then back at him. You still think this is about revenge? He blinked. Isn't it? I shook my head. No. Then I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. I slid it across the table. This is about survival. Daniel frowned as he picked it up.
His eyes moved across the page. Then suddenly, all the color drained from his face. Caroline whispered, "What is it?" Daniel's voice barely worked. "This says," he looked back at me, terrified now, "the company is about to go bankrupt?" The entire room went silent. Caroline grabbed the paper. "What?" One of the investors leaned forward. Daniel looked at me slowly. "You knew about this?" I nodded calmly. "For months." His voice cracked. "And you didn't tell me?" I folded my hands. "You never asked." Daniel stared at the financial report again. Numbers, debt, loans, interest, millions of dollars. His hands started shaking. "This can't be right." I sighed softly. "Oh, Daniel." Then I said the sentence that made his world collapse. "You didn't build a company." I paused. "You built a time bomb."
The boardroom felt colder now, not because the air conditioning had changed, but because the truth had finally entered the room. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, staring at the financial report like it might suddenly rewrite itself. But numbers don't lie, and the numbers were ugly. Millions in debt, 3 delayed construction projects, 2 lawsuits waiting to explode, and a bank loan so large it could sink the entire company. Caroline grabbed the papers from his hands. "This is wrong," she said quickly. "It has to be wrong." Daniel's voice was barely steady. "Where did you get this?" I tapped the folder calmly. "From the bank." His head snapped up. "The bank?" I nodded. "The same bank that gave you that $8 million expansion loan last year." Caroline blinked. "You told me the loan was only $3 million. Daniel didn't answer, because suddenly every person in the room was looking at him. One of the investors leaned forward slowly. $8 million? Daniel swallowed hard. "It was supposed to be temporary." Caroline's face turned pale. "Daniel, what did you do?" He ran his hands through his hair. "The new downtown development, it went over budget." I raised an eyebrow. "By $5 million. Daniel looked miserable now. "We were supposed to land the Harbor Tower contract," he said. "If we got that project, everything would have balanced out." One of the lawyers spoke quietly. "But you didn't get the contract." Daniel shook his head. "No, they gave it to another company." The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what that meant. Without that contract, the company was drowning. Caroline stared at him. "You told me everything was fine." Daniel whispered, "I thought it would be." I leaned forward slightly. "This is what happens when pride replaces good judgment." Daniel looked up at me again. His anger was gone now, replaced by fear. "Mom," he paused. "You knew all this?" "For months," I said. His voice cracked. "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at him carefully. "Would you have listened?" Daniel didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. No, he wouldn't have. Caroline slammed the papers on the table. "This is unbelievable." She pointed at Daniel. "You told me the company was worth millions." "It is," Daniel snapped back. "No, it's not," she yelled. "It's drowning in debt." The argument echoed through the boardroom. Investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel rubbed his temples again. "This wasn't supposed to happen." I sighed softly. "That's what people always say when they gamble with other people's money." Daniel looked up sharply. "I wasn't gambling." "You were hoping," I corrected. "And hope is not a business strategy." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Daniel asked the question that had been building inside him all morning. "Why are you really doing this?" I tilted my head slightly. "What do you mean?" "You could have just let the company fail," he said. "You could have walked away." He gestured toward the documents. "So why buy it?" Caroline crossed her arms. "Yeah," she added bitterly. "Why save his mess?" I looked at both of them, then at the investors, then back at my son. "Because," I said calmly, "it's not just your mess." Daniel frowned. "What?" I opened another folder. Inside were bank documents, contracts, signatures. I slid them across the table. Daniel picked them up slowly. Then suddenly his eyes widened.
No. Caroline leaned over. What is it? Daniel looked up at me like someone had just punched him in the chest. You guaranteed the loan? The entire room went silent again. Caroline blinked. What does that mean? One of the lawyers answered quietly. It means if the company fails, Mrs. Collins is personally responsible for the debt. Caroline stared at me. You're telling me, she pointed at Daniel, if his company collapses, you lose everything? I nodded calmly. Daniel's face went pale. You did this without telling me? Yes. Why? I looked at him gently. Because you asked me to. Daniel shook his head. No, I didn't. You did, I said softly. 3 years ago. His eyebrows pulled together. 3 years ago. You came to my house. I watched the memory slowly return to him. You said the bank wouldn't approve your expansion unless someone guaranteed the loan. Daniel's breathing slowed. And you signed it. I nodded. You said it was just paperwork, he whispered. Caroline looked stunned. You never told me that. Daniel stared at the documents again, his hands trembling now. If the company fails, you lose the house. Yes. And your savings? Yes. And everything Dad left you? I nodded again. Yes, Daniel. The weight of the truth hit him all at once. He sank back into his chair. Oh my God. For the first time in the entire meeting, Daniel looked ashamed. Not defensive, not angry, just ashamed. You risked everything for me. I smiled faintly. That's what mothers do. Caroline looked between us in disbelief. So let me get this straight, she said slowly. You took control of the company to save it? Yes. Daniel whispered, You could have just told me. I shook my head. No. Why not? I leaned forward slightly. Because yesterday, I paused. You told me I was nothing without you. Daniel closed his eyes. The words clearly haunted him now. And then I said something that made his chest tighten. Today, I said quietly, you needed to learn the truth. He looked up slowly. What truth? I held his gaze. The truth that the only reason your company still exists, I paused just long enough, is because your nothing mother saved it. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Daniel looked like he might actually cry. But before anyone could speak, one of the lawyers suddenly cleared his throat. There's one more issue we need to discuss. I frowned slightly. What issue? The lawyer looked uncomfortable now. Mrs. Collins, he hesitated, then said the sentence that shocked the entire room. The bank called this morning. Daniel looked up. Why? The lawyer took a breath. Because they've decided to move the loan deadline. Daniel's stomach dropped. To when? The lawyer looked at me carefully, then at Daniel, and said the words that made Caroline gasp. Tomorrow morning.
The room went completely silent. Tomorrow morning. Those 2 words echoed inside Daniel's head like a hammer. He stared at the lawyer. Tomorrow? The lawyer nodded slowly. The bank has reviewed the company's financial position. Because of the risk involved, they're demanding repayment or restructuring within 24 hours. Caroline shot up from her chair. That's impossible! Daniel felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. 24 hours? He repeated. The lawyer folded his hands calmly. Otherwise, the bank will begin seizure proceedings. Caroline looked around the room wildly. You can't just take someone's company. One of the investors said quietly, That's exactly what banks do. Daniel leaned forward, his voice barely steady. If they seize the company, he looked down at the papers again. Everything's gone. Buildings, projects, equipment, his entire career. But worst of all, he slowly looked up at me. You lose everything too. I simply nodded. Yes. Caroline turned to me in disbelief. And you're just sitting there like this is fine? I took a slow sip of water. It's not fine. Daniel rubbed his face. We need time.
The lawyer shook his head. The bank isn't offering time. Daniel's mind was racing now. How much? The lawyer glanced at the document. To stabilize the loan, the company needs $4 million immediately. Caroline laughed nervously. $4 million? That's insane! Daniel leaned back in his chair. Because he knew something she didn't. There was no way they could raise that kind of money overnight. None. The company accounts were nearly empty. The investors had already pulled back. And the projects that could save them were months away. Daniel whispered to himself, "It's over." For the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Collins looked defeated, completely defeated. Caroline shook her head. "This is your fault," she snapped. Daniel looked up at her. "My fault? You were the one pushing for the expansion," he shot back. The argument exploded across the boardroom, voices rising, blame flying, but I simply watched quietly. After a moment, I raised my hand. Enough. The room went silent again. Daniel looked at me. "Mom, there's nothing we can do." I tilted my head slightly. "Are you sure?" He frowned. "Yes." I slid one final envelope across the table. "Then maybe you should read that." Daniel looked confused as he picked it up. "What is this?" "Open it." He tore the envelope slowly. Inside was a single document, a bank confirmation letter. His eyes scanned the page. Then suddenly, his entire face froze. "What?" Caroline leaned over. "What is it?" Daniel's voice came out barely above a whisper. "It says," he looked back at me, "the loan has already been paid." The entire room went silent. Caroline blinked. "Paid?" Daniel read the document again. $4 million? Transferred this morning? He slowly looked up at me. "You did this?" I smiled gently. "Yes." Caroline's jaw dropped. "You had $4 million just sitting around?" I shrugged slightly. "I've had it for a while." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "You saved the company." "Yes." His voice cracked slightly. "You saved me." For the first time all day, Daniel looked like a little boy again. Not the confident CEO, not the arrogant businessman, just a son. And he suddenly stood up. The entire room watched as he walked around the table. Then something no one expected. Daniel Collins dropped to his knees, right in front of me. Caroline gasped, "Daniel!" But he didn't care. His eyes were full of regret. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I was arrogant. I was selfish." He looked down at the floor. "And I said the worst thing a son could ever say." My chest tightened slightly. "You said I was nothing," I said softly. Daniel nodded slowly. "But the truth is," he looked up at me again, "I'm nothing without you." For a moment, no one moved. Then I stood up slowly, placed my hand on his shoulder, and helped him back to his feet. "You're not nothing, Daniel." He wiped his eyes. "But you needed to remember something." "What?" I smiled softly. "That you didn't build your life alone." The tension in the room finally broke. Even some of the investors smiled, but Caroline still looked stunned. "You just gave him $4 million after everything he said to you?" I turned to her calmly. "I didn't give it to him." She frowned. "What?" "I invested in the company." Daniel blinked. "Wait, what?" I slid another document across the table. My new position. Daniel read the page slowly, then laughed in disbelief. "Chairwoman of the board?" I nodded. "That's right." Caroline sighed dramatically. So she's your boss forever now. Daniel smiled slightly. Yeah. Then he looked at me again. You planned all of this, didn't you? I raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? He laughed softly. Because you taught me everything I know about strategy. I smiled. Well, I glanced at the clock. You did say I was nothing without you. Daniel shook his head. I'm never saying that again. One of the investors chuckled. That's probably wise. The meeting slowly began to wrap up. Papers were signed, plans were discussed, but as everyone stood to leave, Daniel stopped me near the door. Mom? Yes? He hesitated, then asked quietly, Did you really do all of this just to teach me a lesson? I thought about that for a moment, then smiled gently. Partly. And the other part? I looked around the office, at the company he built, then back at my son. The other part, I said softly, was making sure my son didn't destroy his future. Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, Daniel hugged me properly. Not the quick, distracted hug from before, but the kind that actually means something. Sometimes life doesn't teach us lessons gently. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what we should have valued all along. And in Daniel's case, that lesson only took 24 hours.